How about not doing this? How about not doing that? This is the question that guided Masanobu Fukuoka, the author of the One Straw Xevolution, as he developed his method of do-nothing farming. And it's the same question I've asked myself over the years, as we've continually simplified our approach to gardening by eliminating a number of gardening practices and products. But what about our remaining practices? Can we simplify them further and get closer to Fukuoka's do-nothing ideal while still getting great results? Today I'll take a look at our remaining gardening practices that maintain soil fertility. I'll talk about how we've simplified them so far and consider if any of them can be simplified further or even eliminated in the future. Making enough compost for our garden could be time-consuming and back-breaking work, especially if we were trying to make compost quickly by turning it frequently. So early on I asked myself the question, how about not turning compost often? The approach we settled on is to have multiple piles that are started at different times for an ongoing supply of compost. Some are dedicated to slow composting and some to fast composting. The slow piles typically have a higher carbon to nitrogen ratio than the hot piles and don't contain any food scraps. They don't heat up very much and break down more slowly. They contain plenty of coarse brown material, which helps keep air in the pile, and we never have to turn them. We would turn them if they became anaerobic and smelled bad, but it's never happened. So the slow piles don't require any work other than adding the organic matter and eventually harvesting the compost. We also don't turn our hot compost piles frequently. Our rule of thumb is to only turn them when the center of the pile reaches 150 degrees Fahrenheit or 66 degrees Celsius. This ensures that the pile doesn't get too hot, but minimizes turning. Typically we turn a hot pile only once or twice. Using temperature as a guide also tells us if we need to add more green ingredients to heat up the pile or more browns to cool it down. Our fall-winter compost piles, which may not reach 150 degrees Fahrenheit because of the cold, are turned only once in the spring. Another technique we use to minimize turning is to punch holes in the compost with rebar. This gets oxygen into the pile and allows us to add water without churning. If needed, more green ingredients like coffee grounds can be added to heat up the pile as well. Minimizing turning helps us get a little bit closer to a do-nothing garden. But after years of adding compost to the soil, it's possible that we can get even closer. In the spring we're going to have our soil tested. If the test shows large nutrient surpluses, we'll significantly cut back our compost production. Though we'll continue to compost organic matter generated on site, we'll stop collecting additional resources like used coffee grounds and neighbors' leaves, at least until the nutrient levels are no longer in large surplus. For the most part, keeping composting worms to process food scraps doesn't require much work, but harvesting castings can, especially if you manually separate the worms from the castings. So to keep work to a minimum, we use flow-through worm bins. As food is added to the top of the bin, the worms naturally migrate to the top where the fresh food is, leaving their castings below. Castings are then harvested from the bottom. Though some worms remain at the bottom, we don't go to the trouble of separating them from their castings. Instead, we just add them along with the castings to the garden. Because we mulch our garden beds, the worms have enough food to survive in the garden. As with compost, if our soil test shows that we have large nutrient surpluses, we'll also cut back on our vermicomposting operation and possibly find a new home for some of our worms. This will take us yet another step closer to a do-nothing garden. When Fukuoka asked, how about not doing this, how about not doing that, he actually decided not to make compost. Instead, he returned organic matter back to the soil as mulch. Though we'll continue to make compost, we'll likely shift our emphasis from compost to mulch as we go forward, especially if the soil test shows nutrient surpluses. Mulching is considerably less work than composting and releases nutrients into the soil more slowly. This change in emphasis will definitely bring us closer to the ideal of a do-nothing garden. Fukuoka also used nitrogen-fixing cover crops, and so do we. It couldn't be easier to plant our fall mix of cover crops, which includes a variety of legumes and oats. The legumes need at least a couple of months to fix nitrogen, so we plant them a couple of months before the first frost. And they die back in the winter, so we don't even have to chop and drop them. Nature ends up doing almost all of the work for us by fixing nitrogen and killing the crops before spring planting. This is a perfect example of a do-nothing gardening method. We've been using compost, vermicompost, mulch, and actively aerated compost tea for years, with the intention of building a healthy soil food web. But I would think after all this time, the soil would be well inoculated with beneficial microbes, and that a simpler maintenance regime might be in order. The only way to find out is to do less and see what happens. So when I ask, how about not doing this, how about not doing that, I can't help but wonder what would happen if we stopped using compost tea. Would we notice a difference in the garden? Wouldn't the compost, worm castings, and mulch be sufficient to maintain a healthy soil food web? So this year I plan to conduct a compost tea field trial. I'll set up 2 identical garden beds and plant the same crops in each bed. One bed will receive compost tea applications, the other won't, and I'll compare the results in some detail. I also plan to stop using compost tea in the rest of the garden and make informal observations about this year's crops compared to those from previous years. Over the next several weeks, I'll share more of the details about the field trial in videos and in the Home Garden Field Trials G+ community. If you'd like to participate in the trial, help develop a standard compost tea recipe for the trial, or provide input on the field trial guidelines, please join the Home Garden Field Trials community. There's a link to the community in the description below. So I do think it's possible to get closer to Fukuoka's do-nothing ideal while still getting great results. If our soil test in the spring shows nutrient surpluses, we'll cut back on our production of compost and worm castings. And if we don't observe benefits from compost tea in the field trial, we'll stop making compost tea, significantly decreasing our labor and increasing our leisure time in the garden. Well, that's all for now. Thank you very much for watching. And until next time, remember, you can change the world 1 yard at a time.